Hello, my name is Micah Murray, and it's my pleasure today to be part of CNS 2020 Virtual. Of course, this work would not at all be possible without an amazing team of colleagues both locally and internationally, as well as our very generous funders. I want to immediately take a moment to acknowledge them and the hard work that they do and that I get to present to you today. So why should we reconsider the gradients that scaffold multisensory processes, and by extension, those that are underlying cognition? A typical schematic of functional brain organization will have primary cortices converging and integrating their information only at higher levels of the brain. For example, the superior-temporal sulcus or the prefrontal cortices. In our investigations of cognition and perception, we of course want to know who talks to whom in the brain, when, to say what, and ultimately to what end. New data showing that the primary cortices are directly and monosynaptically connected forces us to reconsider these gradients. But how do we put this new anatomic evidence into a functional schematic? Well, first we need to demonstrate that in humans, indeed, multisensory convergence and interactions do indeed occur in primary cortices, that these are impacting behavior and perception, that they persist beyond the current stimulus response to directly contribute to cognitive functions such as recognition memory, that these are linked to cognition, and potentially its breakdown across the lifespan. And finally, that cross-modal inputs can change the way that we're examining and considering the role of task-selective and sensory-independent brain organization. So let's jump right into it. How do we demonstrate that multisensory convergence and interactions occur in primary cortices? Well, one approach would be to take fMRI data. The problem or challenge that we confront with that is the analysis is in the amplitude domain, and it's not immediately evident what statistical criterion is most appropriate to identify a voxel or brain region as multisensory in nature. But we decided to circumvent some of these interpretational caveats, or potential interpretational caveats, and look instead at time-resolved event-related functional magnetic resonance imaging. In this case, typically what we acquire is one volume per TR, or repetition time. What we did instead was to jitter the stimulus presentation with respect to the volume acquisition. By doing so repeatedly and over again, we effectively create what is like a flip book of our HRF, and from that we can look not only at the slope and latency, but also the peak amplitude to define multisensory loci. We did this in the context of a simple detection task involving auditory, visual, and multisensory stimuli. And what we observe is voxels within primary auditory and primary visual cortices demonstrate both convergence and integration. And the way that we demonstrate that is that the responses, for example, in primary auditory cortices bilaterally, exhibit not only a response to the auditory stimulus in red, but a non-zero and robust response to visual stimuli in blue. Therefore, it's convergence. Likewise, in primary visual cortices bilaterally, we observe convergence such that there is a robust response to visual stimuli, but also a non-zero robust response to auditory stimuli. Again, convergence. The integration aspect is observed by looking at the slope and peak latency of the HRF within both primary auditory and primary visual cortices. Here it is shown in the histogram in the bottom of the graph, the peak latency of these curves, these HRF functions. What we observe is that the peak is earlier under multisensory than either unisensory condition alone. Therefore, integration. What we also observe is that the multisensory response in black is of subadditive amplitude with respect to auditory or visual responses alone, both in primary auditory and primary visual cortices. That's with a very slow TR. More recent developments are using the same approach with a much faster TR. Here a TR of 371 milliseconds. And here what one can observe is that, again, the multisensory response has an earlier peak and a steeper slope than either the auditory or visual responses alone. In addition to using MRI to investigate this question of multisensory convergence and integration in primary cortices, we're also using high-density electroencephalography. The quasi-stationarity of this measurement allows for linear modeling of multisensory integration. That is, we can take the multisensory response and compare it to the unisensory responses summed together. However, we have to remove any common activity. And the way that we do that is by taking a paradigm, here a movement detection task, and separating those trials that are go trials, here shaded out, from those that are no-go but nonetheless attended. Therefore, we have attention to all of the trials, but no confound of motor response. When we do this, what we observe is that there are nonlinear neural response interactions in the event-related potentials to these stimuli. That is, the multisensory responses in black and the summed unisensory responses in red are nonlinear and do not simply add. What we observe is that these nonlinear interactions begin at approximately 60 milliseconds post-stimulus onset and are the consequence of topographic, that is, a change in the topography at the scalp, and not simple amplitude changes, that is, simply a stronger or weaker response. We can also use distributed source estimations and their statistical analysis to demonstrate that these nonlinear interactions are occurring first at these early latencies of 60 to 95 milliseconds within primary auditory and primary visual cortices bilaterally, and moreover that these regions or source estimations are themselves functionally coupled under multisensory but not unisensory conditions. So using both fMRI and EEG, we now demonstrate convergence and integration. But how do we now demonstrate that this is having an impact on behavior and perception? Well, we go back to those go trials in this paradigm of motion detection, and here we analyze the go trials and ignore the no-go trials. These go trials allow for an additive factors analysis as well as a link to behavior. When we do that, what we observe is that there is a change in the global field power of the event-related potential, specifically in the case of multisensory looming, but not for other combinations of receding or looming stimuli. And this nonlinear response in global field power is correlated with behavioral gain that one observes in detecting motion stimuli that are multisensory and looming. Moreover, these effects are again within primary visual cortices and extending inferiorly and laterally within occipital cortices. We can take this further in a causal inference domain by combining a simple detection task. Here, participants are detecting the presence of a visual stimulus, an auditory stimulus, or multisensory stimulus, and combining that with single pulse TMS over the occipital pole. When one combines this with just the visual task, one observes that reaction times to stimuli, or detection of stimuli, is indeed slowed, as has been observed since the late 1980s. When one combines a single pulse TMS over the occipital pole with detection of an auditory stimulus, reaction times over the same time period are facilitated. And under multisensory conditions, we effectively observe no effect on behavior, on detection. And what we observe is that that gain with external stimuli is correlated with the gain that one observes with external auditory stimulus and a TMS pulse over the occipital scalp, suggesting that TMS facilitates the detection of sounds and indeed emulates multisensory processes. We can take this a bit further by looking not only at improvement of detection speed, but also the ability of sounds to increase the excitability of visual cortices. The way that we achieve that is by looking at phosphine induction as a proxy for the excitability of the visual cortex. Here, what you're observing is the probability of reporting a phosphine in the presence of a TMS pulse that has been titrated on an individual basis to be at 85% of their defined threshold. That is, participants report a phosphine about 27% of the time. When we then combine this TMS pulse with a sound, a simple beep, what we observe is that we can increase the excitability of the visual cortex vis-a-vis the percentage of trials when participants report a phosphene. Here, following an approximate alpha cycle and peaking at a delay of approximately 95 or 90 milliseconds between the onset of the sound and the TMS pulse over the occipital scalp. We can also look at the dynamics of these effects of using sounds to change the excitability of visual cortices by calculating a psychometric function as well as a neurometric function. And the way that we achieve that is by having participants tell us the difference between a looming sound or approaching sound and a sound that stays static, that is the same amplitude over time. And what we do is we apply TMS either always at the end of the sound, and the sounds were either 70 milliseconds, 80 milliseconds, 90 milliseconds, etc., up through 230 milliseconds. And from that, we can know whether or not participants can accurately discriminate looming versus stationary sounds, as well as whether the probability of inducing a phosphene, that is the excitability of visual cortices, are sensitive to looming versus stationary sounds. What we observe is that the psychometric function gives a center across participants of 115 milliseconds. That is, the sounds need to be 115 milliseconds to achieve equal probability of reporting it as looming versus stationary. By contrast, the neurometric function, that is, when the sounds change reliably the excitability of visual cortices, differs between looming and stationary sounds when the sounds are 80 milliseconds in duration. The interpretation of this is that the visual cortex, in this case, the primary visual cortex, is able to differentiate looming versus stationary sounds before we are in a perceptually meaningful way. Moreover, we can take these data for each and every individual subject and determine what is the center of each individual's neurometric function relative to their psychometric function. And what we see consistently across individuals is there is this 35 millisecond delay between when the visual cortex exhibits differentiation between looming and stationary sound and when the individual, the observer themselves, is able to report looming versus stationary sounds. From these data, we argue that the primary visual cortex is indeed sensitive to excitability changes by sounds in a pre-perceptual manner. One might ask, do these multisensory processes persist beyond current stimulus processing, and do they contribute to cognitive functions such as recognition memory? The way that we examine this question is by taking a more naturalistic approach to what the environment is like. In this vignette, imagine yourself as a rabbit in the savannah and that you come across some experiences in your environment, such as the following. An elephant, a roaring, a monkey that meows, and a hawk that beeps. You then continue with your day. Different events take place. And then later, you have unisensory experiences of these animals again. The question that we wanted to address is whether the bunny in this case, or the participants in the lab, would differentially respond to the elephant, lion, monkey, and hawk depending on how they initially experienced these events as unisensory, multisensory and semantically congruent, multisensory and semantically incongruent, or multisensory and effectively meaningless. In the lab, we aren't using images of animals, but rather a continuous recognition task involving snodgrass images, as well as sounds, so that for each and every image, the participants have to tell us whether or not it is being presented for the first time or for a repeated time. Unbeknownst to the participants, some of the initial presentations were multisensory, but all of the image repetitions, at least in our initial investigations, were unisensory, in this case visual. This allows us to differentiate different types of repeated events. Those that had been only unisensory, which we'll call V-, those that had initially been multisensory and semantically congruent, which we'll call V plus C, those that had been initially multisensory but semantically incongruent, which we'll call V plus I, and those that had been presented with a meaningless sound but are now again unisensory and visual, which we'll call V plus M. What we observe across studies, as well as when the task is either performed in the visual modality or in the auditory modality, is that single trial multisensory experiences can improve later unisensory recognition. That is, a single multisensory event is sufficient for us to take advantage perceptually and behaviorally of the multisensory information to enhance our memory and recognition memory abilities. Moreover, we also demonstrate using electroencephalography as well as functional magnetic resonance imaging that single trial multisensory experiences can help us differentiate incoming unisensory information. For example, if we look at the event-related potentials to repeated visual stimuli that are just visual and unisensory, but have different multisensory paths, either multisensory and semantically congruent or just unisensory, event-related potentials first differ to these visual stimuli starting at 60 milliseconds according to how they had been previously encountered. These effects occur within occipital cortices. Likewise, if the participants are performing an auditory task, they can differentiate between those sounds that had been encountered in a semantically congruent multisensory context versus those of repeated sounds that had only been encountered in a purely unisensory context, starting at 35 milliseconds within temporal cortices. These results give some insight into theories of reintegration or how memory consolidation might take place, and suggest that unisensory cortices, or what are traditionally thought of as unisensory cortices, in fact contain multisensory information for memory or have access to them. So can we take this a step farther and investigate how there may be a link between low-level multisensory processes and these cognitive functions, including recognition memory? To do this, we need to look at inter-individual differences in multisensory processes. That is, do all individuals respond to these repeated stimulus presentations in a similar way? To do that, we went to our paradigm involving initial encounters that were either unisensory and visual, or multisensory and semantically meaningless, that is, a simple beep. What we observed is that there were some individuals who indeed improve their recognition memory, and other individuals who demonstrate impaired recognition memory on repetitions of these unisensory stimuli. We then went back and examined whether there was any predictive value of how these multisensory stimuli were encoded. We looked at the event-related potentials to these multisensory stimuli and observed that those individuals who would later improve also showed a stronger multisensory response, here around 260 milliseconds. Those individuals who would later be impaired showed a weaker multisensory response. By contrast, there was no general and statistically reliable difference in visual responses at their initial encounter, suggesting it's not specifically a group difference, but rather their interaction between the group and multisensory versus unisensory processing. We did the same thing in a different cohort of subjects performing the task in the auditory modality, and again observed there were some individuals that improve and some individuals that are impaired. And again, those individuals who would later improve are also those individuals with stronger multisensory responses, with no difference, again, in general auditory responsiveness between the groups. Collectively, these two data sets would suggest that the extent to which an individual shows strong responses to multisensory stimuli, even if it's single trial and task irrelevant, is predictive of their later recognition memory performance. So the question that comes out of this is, can multisensory processes be used as screening tools? And the reason this would be important is to be able to assess in a low-cost, efficient, and accessible manner whether or not a child, for example, is at risk for learning disabilities, if we can use a simple low-level multisensory task to assess higher-level cognition. So the way that we tested this is in a group of public school children here in Switzerland, 68 children, aged 4.5 to 15 years old. and we had them perform a simple detection task with auditory, visual, or multisensory stimuli. What we could calculate from this is a measure of multisensory gain, that is, the percentage in facilitation of reaction times for the multisensory condition versus the better of the unisensory conditions for each child. From that, we could then predict how well that child would do on this same multisensory memory task that I showed you previously. That is, a child with a larger multisensory gain would illustrate a larger benefit on their recognition memory score. Here, a lab-based task, but it also generalized to a working memory task that used in neuropsychological examinations, here the ascending digit score, which involves the experimenter or tester giving a set of numbers, for example 7, 5, 3, 9, and the child reporting back the numbers in ascending order, 3, 5, 7, 9. Here again, a stronger multisensory gain was predictive of a larger working memory span. And finally, we could also predict from this multisensory gain fluid intelligence scores as measured using Raven's progressive matrices. All of these scores have been age-corrected or age-standardized. Therefore, a simple detection task is capable of predicting a wide range of higher-level cognitive abilities and cognitive scores, suggesting that a low-level multisensory task might well be an efficient and low-cost screening tool to complement other neuropsychological evaluations. We can ask the same thing at the other end of the age spectrum in terms of helping us address the diagnostic challenge of healthy aging versus mild cognitive impairment. As you may know, evaluating and testing for mild cognitive impairment is time and resource consuming, not only for the patients, but also for the clinicians. Materials need to be purchased, clinicians need to be trained, and we also have to convince older individuals to agree to have these clinical examinations. Moreover, the results can sometimes be biased by factors like intelligence quotient, socioeconomic status, as well as the testers themselves. So we wanted to see if a simple multisensory task, as you've observed with children, would also be efficient in helping screen between healthy aging and mild cognitive impairment. What we observe looking across our three groups of participants, healthy young, healthy older, and mild cognitive impairment, is that there's a shift in the frequency of sensory dominance. That is, which of the two unisensory conditions lead to faster reaction times. Healthy young show a division of approximately 38 to 62%. Healthy older, about 30 to 70%. And mild cognitive impairment are all auditory dominant. That is, all of our participants had faster reaction times to the auditory than to the visual stimuli. We can quantify this auditory gain and see again that this seems to increase as one shifts from healthy young to healthy older to mild cognitive impairment. By contrast, the multisensory gain on reaction times as a percentage versus the better of the two unisensory conditions seems relatively stable as one goes from healthy young to healthy older to mild cognitive impairment. These two measures, or percent auditory gain and percent multisensory gain, seem to be negatively correlated across our healthy young and healthy older participants, even when controlling for age. More importantly, what we were able to do was use this combined measure of sensory dominance and multisensory gain as a way to classify between healthy older and mild cognitive impaired participants, again as a complement to existing clinical tools to help pre-screen or at least identify potential at-risk individuals for mild cognitive impairment. And finally, we can use low-level multisensory information or cross-modal inputs to examine the extent of task-selective, sensory-independent brain organization. What I mean by that is that in instances, for example, of blindness or deafness, one might ask the question of what are those cortical territories able to achieve in the absence of incoming sensory information, for example, vision. A long history of research by individuals like Amir Mehdi and others has used sensory substitution to reveal that there is indeed a task-selective and sensory-independent brain organization. Regions such as the fusiform face area, for example, can respond to sensory substitution versions of faces, those that are taken from an image and converted to a sound, and that these fusiform face and other high-level visual cortices will respond in a selective manner to the faceness of the stimulus once learned. However, what we don't know are the spatiotemporal dynamics of seeing with sound. The way that we could attack that question is by using event-related potentials, which allow us to look at the spatiotemporal brain dynamics of these functions. Here we had 9 congenitally blind participants that were listening to soundscapes of the following types of information. These stimuli were faces and scrambled faces. To our blind participants, they were able to easily discriminate between those that were representing faces and scrambled faces, and their event-related potentials were also discriminating between faces and scrambled faces. Here, a representative electrode at frontal central midline, parieto-occipital midline. What we can observe is that starting at approximately 380 milliseconds, the congenitally blind can indeed see faces conveyed by soundscapes, and that these effects occur first within the fusiform face area. It does suggest that indeed visual cortices, normally involved in face processing, are the first to demonstrate sensitivity to faces conveyed via soundscapes. We also can imagine looking a step further at the implicit differentiation between stimulus orientation. Here, taking one example of a letter that is predominantly horizontal versus another letter that is predominantly vertical in its orientation. What we observe is that the brain again is able to differentiate between these two sets of stimuli, despite the same behavioral task required of them, starting here at 270 milliseconds post-stimulus onset, with the effects happening first within primary visual cortices. This suggests that the primary visual cortex of the congenitally blind, despite years and even decades of blindness, retains its sensitivity to orientation information, even if this is implicit to the stimulus. So, what should you take home? Well, hopefully that you reconsider what gradients scaffold multisensory processes. For example, that multisensory convergence and interactions indeed occur in primary cortices, and that this prompts a new schema of functional brain organization. Second, that multisensory processes in low-level cortices do indeed impact behavior and perception, but we don't know yet how these develop and how these are controlled across the lifespan. Moreover, multisensory processes indeed do persist beyond the current stimulus response and directly contribute to processes such as recognition memory. The question, of course, now remains of how these can be trained, how this can then in turn be applied in educational and clinical settings. Low-level multisensory processes can indeed predict global cognition and its breakdown across the lifespan, whether in school children or in older individuals suffering from mild cognitive impairment. What this suggests is we may be on track for a cost-effective and democratized screening and intervention tool. Finally, cross-modal inputs show the extent of task-selective, sensory-independent brain organization. This has an impact on how we might conduct vision rehabilitation, but also how we might consider what does it mean to see, what does it mean to hear. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, for attending the virtual conference of the Cognitive Neuroscience Society, and I look forward to discussing these data with you.